Welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy slow, atmospheric explorations of forgotten history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a night of strange stories. That tonight's episode takes us to the bridges of the Middle Ages, not the grand stone arches of legend, but the narrow, creaking, fog-draped crossings that once made villagers pause and reconsider their steps. Because in the medieval world, a bridge was never just a way across. It was a boundary, a bet, a symbol, and for some, a place to avoid after dark at all costs. Let's step slowly into why bridges, more than any other structure, were the most feared paths in medieval Europe. Bridges today are ordinary, part of the background noise of daily life. We walk or drive over them without a second thought. But in the Middle Ages, bridges were anything but ordinary. They were deeply unsettling places, mysterious, sometimes feared more than forests, mountains, or even the open sea. And not because they were physically dangerous, though they often were, but because they stood at the edge of human understanding. To begin with, the very concept of a bridge was unnatural to many people. In a time when the average peasant rarely traveled beyond their village, most of life happened within predictable borders: roads, footpaths, open fields. Rivers and streams marked limits, natural boundaries where one place ended and another began. But a bridge, a structure that let you walk across a flowing river, that defied what people understood to be safe. In many minds, it felt like cheating nature, and anything that cheated nature could not be trusted. Add to that the sound, the creaking wood beneath your feet, the wind echoing through the railings, the muffled splash of water far below. For those used to the solid, unmoving earth, the strange, sensory experience of walking on a suspended platform was unsettling. Imagine a villager, never having traveled far, crossing a tall bridge for the first time. The planks moved, the wind pushed, the water below never stopped. Some would freeze halfway and need help to continue. Others simply refused to cross. At all that in many parts of Europe, bridges were more than just feared. They were avoided. Where possible, people would choose to ford a shallow part of a river, even if it meant getting wet, cold, or risking injury. A fixed bridge, especially one made of stone or stretching high above a ravine, was seen as suspicious. Why? Because bridges had reputations. People whispered that odd things happened on them. Tales spread quickly in medieval villages. One old man falls ill after crossing a certain bridge. A merchant's cart breaks a wheel halfway over another. A group of pilgrims disappears after choosing the shortcut that included a long stone bridge. These stories grew, shifted, became half-truths, and slowly, they became warnings passed from generation to generation. But the fear wasn't only based on stories. It was also rooted in symbolism. In medieval thought, the physical world was full of meaning, and bridges were transitional. You weren't just going from one side to another. You were crossing a boundary, from safety to risk, from home to the unknown. That act of crossing made people vulnerable to more than just accidents or structural collapse. Vulnerable to bad luck, to evil, to unseen forces. That in some regions, travelers would pause before crossing a bridge to mutter a prayer or make the sign of the cross, not out of devotion, but out of fear. Some even carried charms or talismans specifically to protect them during crossings. Small bags of herbs, bones, or iron filings. Tiny safeguards against whatever might be lurking between the riverbanks. And then, there were the bridges themselves. Many were poorly built, rickety, narrow, and lacking any kind of rail or barrier. Crossing them on foot was difficult enough. On horseback or with a cart, that was a gamble. A sudden gust of wind or a misstep from a startled animal could lead to disaster. People died on bridges. And when someone died in a strange or sudden way, the explanation wasn't always accident. It might have been the bridge itself, Some bridges gained reputations. People said they were cursed, or watched, or that you should never look over the side at night. One particular bridge in southern France was known locally as the Whispering Cross, because travelers claimed to hear soft voices when walking over it after dusk. No one ever found a source for the sounds, but the name stuck, and fewer people crossed it when the sun went down. Of course, it wasn't all superstition. There were real dangers, too. Highwaymen and robbers often lurked near bridges, knowing that travelers had no choice but to cross. The narrowness of the bridge made ambushes easy. No room to turn, no space to flee. Some lords posted guards near major bridges, not to protect from invaders, but to keep the peace and stop theft. But not every bridge had such protection. In remote areas, some people simply vanished, and the last place they were seen was somewhere near the bridge. There's even evidence that people believed certain bridges needed to be paid to ensure safety, not just in tolls to the local lord or bridgekeeper, but in offerings. Coins tossed into the river beneath, bread left at the entrance, whispered words to the air. These rituals weren't always explained, even by those who practiced them. They were just done, because when something might save your life, you didn't question it. Architecturally, bridges were often strange-looking, especially to the medieval eye. They bent at odd angles, arched over nothing but mist and wind. The supports creaked in the cold. In the dead of winter, ice would hang from the edges, making them look like frozen fangs. In the summer, heat would make them shimmer unnaturally in the air. Some bridges appeared almost to breathe, expanding and contracting with the temperature. No wonder people thought they might be alive, or haunted. Even monks and clerics, people expected to be rational, sometimes avoided certain bridges. Writings from a 13th century Benedictine record mention a brother who chose to take a 2-day detour rather than cross a particular bridge known for its unsettling echo. Ultimately, bridges in the Middle Ages were more than just functional. They were symbolic, psychological, spiritual. They represented transition and danger, change and risk. And in a world already full of instability, most people had enough to worry about without adding mysterious man-made crossings to the list. In the Middle Ages, most people believed the world was full of invisible forces. These weren't necessarily demons or angels, but things in between. Spirits, shadows, presences that lingered in forests, wells, crossroads, and yes, bridges. If something strange happened in a field, you might chalk it up to weather. If it happened in your home, perhaps a bad dream. But if it happened on a bridge, it meant something. People paid attention. They remembered. Because bridges were considered thresholds between spaces, they were seen as especially vulnerable to otherworldly interference. The legend of the bridge keeper in many villages. There were stories of a bridge spirit or bridge keeper. Not a person, but a presence that demanded respect. One popular tale from Central Europe tells of an invisible figure who watches over a certain bridge and becomes angry if someone crosses too quickly or without acknowledging its presence. Those who forgot to say a prayer before crossing might find their horse go lame, or worse, find themselves unable to move, as if the air itself had frozen their limbs. These were not isolated beliefs. Across different cultures, Welsh, Slavic, French, Scandinavian, bridges were seen as places that needed attention. You couldn't just walk across like it was any ordinary road. To do so showed disrespect, and disrespect had consequences. The sound of the water meant more than you think in Old Norse and Germanic beliefs. Moving water was often thought to block spirits. Ghosts, it was believed, couldn't cross running water. But that also meant anyone crossing water via a bridge was briefly between two realms, the world of the living and the world beyond. So imagine the psychology. Every time you walked across a bridge, especially one that spanned a river, known for drowning incidents, it wasn't just a trip across space, it was a brush with death. You were passing over the element that separated your world from something darker, quieter, and final. And if you stumbled, or the wind howled too loudly, or a plank creaked just wrong, it could feel like the spirits beneath were reaching up, toll. Bridges and the souls beneath. In some superstitions, it wasn't just money that was expected when crossing a toll bridge. In certain French and Italian traditions, people whispered of bridges that demanded more: a drop of blood, a strand of hair, a whispered name. These weren't standard practices, but rumors. Whispers of bridges that took a little something from you, whether you noticed or not. Even bridge keepers themselves, real people employed to watch over and maintain bridges, were sometimes feared. In some rural areas, people believed the bridge keeper had made a pact with something under the river to protect the bridge. In return, he had to offer it small tributes, perhaps an animal once a season, or silence when screams came from below. Whether or not these stories were true didn't matter. They shaped behavior. They made people hesitant. And more importantly, they made bridges into places of myth, engineering as fear, when brilliance looked like witchcraft. Now, here's the thing. Some medieval bridges were truly ahead of their time. Tall, sweeping, solid stone structures that defied gravity and water alike. But when someone saw one of these for the first time, especially someone from a small rural village, it didn't inspire admiration. It inspired fear. How could stone float? Why didn't it collapse? Who had made it? When the answers weren't obvious, people filled in the gaps with magic. In Germany and parts of France, many stone bridges were called Devil's Bridges. Teufelsbrück. The stories all varied slightly, but the core idea was the same. No human could build such a bridge without help from dark forces. Some said the devil himself offered to build the bridge for a builder in exchange for the first soul to cross it. In the stories, this trick is usually avoided by sending a dog or goat across first, cheating the devil. But even in these tales, the price of progress was feared. In fact, bridges that lasted too long could arouse suspicion. If the storms came, and the town flooded but the bridge held, some saw it not as sturdy engineering, but as a sign that something unnatural was at work. And once that idea took hold, people crossed more cautiously, or avoided the bridge entirely. Superstition had more power than stone, rituals, and taboos. The rules of crossing. In some areas, people developed very specific rituals for bridge crossing. Never speak while crossing. Always enter with your right foot first. Never look back. Once you've stepped on, don't let your shadow touch the railing. Don't cross a bridge barefoot, lest something from the water cling to your skin. These weren't official rules written anywhere, but they were remembered, passed down, repeated until they became normal. And the scariest part? Most people couldn't explain why they followed them. They just did. Because deep down, they felt true. There were even seasonal taboos. During harvest festivals, for instance, some villages prohibited crossing bridges after dark. In spring, offerings were left near bridge bases, flowers, grain, or even braided ribbons to bless the passage. To our modern minds, these might seem quaint, but to the medieval mind, they were insurance. You never knew what might be waiting. Accidents became warnings. Of course, bridges were dangerous. Wooden planks rotted, ropes snapped, horses panicked. When tragedy struck, it was rarely chalked up to poor design or weather. It was attributed to unseen punishment. Maybe the traveler didn't show respect. Maybe the bridge had gone too long without an offering. Or maybe the bridge was full and couldn't hold another soul. In a strange way, people treated bridges almost like living beings. You didn't cross a bridge, you asked it. With your actions, with your silence, with your care. And if it accepted you, you passed. If not, you might slip, or fall, or never make it to the other side at all. By the 13th century, travel in medieval Europe had become increasingly common. Whether it was merchants, pilgrims, messengers, or tax collectors, thousands of people moved from village to village, city to city. Yet one factor consistently complicated their journey, the need to cross a bridge. Not because there were too few bridges, though that was sometimes the case, but because people were hesitant to use them even when they were right in front of them. Fear of bridges didn't just exist. In stories, it physically shaped how roads were built and used. Historical records from parts of France, Bohemia, and rural Britain show that entire paths diverted around rivers simply because the local bridge was considered dangerous, not structurally, but spiritually or mysteriously. Travelers would rather lose hours, even days, than cross a bridge known for bad crossings, even if no official explanation was ever written down. The whispers were enough that in some cases, fear of a specific bridge became so embedded in local culture that alternative crossings developed organically. Small, unofficial ferries run by locals who charged silver for what was effectively a short rowboat ride. It cost more. It took longer, but it felt safer. The bridge stood and used nearby, perfectly stable, well built, and completely avoided. Even when the ferry sank once or twice a year, people returned to it anyway. The logic wasn't about safety. It was about control. On a ferry, the person steering was someone you could see. On a bridge, anything could happen. This deep unease didn't just linger in rural regions. In some of the more developed cities, like Bruges or Lübeck, maps from the 14th century show road routes that awkwardly snake around central bridges, even where that detour meant crossing through crowded markets or swampy terrain. In parts of central Italy, tax records show that certain bridges saw far fewer travelers than would be expected based on nearby traffic. Officials even tried lowering tolls to get more people to cross. It rarely worked. The fear was stronger than the economics. Part of what made medieval bridges so unsettling was their in-between nature. You weren't on land. You weren't in water. You were suspended, vulnerable to the elements, exposed to wind, surrounded by depth and echo. The sound of hooves on wooden planks, the creak of rope, the hollow rhythm of footsteps. They were all reminders that this was a temporary path. If anything broke, there was no backup. And people had seen enough collapses to know that when a bridge failed, it did so without warning. One snap, one shift, one scream, gone. There are documented instances in municipal reports where bridges were repaired multiple times in a single year, not because of structural failure, but because locals kept vandalizing them. Not out of anger, but out of fear. In at least 3 known cases, villagers sabotaged their own bridges to keep strangers from crossing, or to avoid facing whatever was rumored to be on the bridge. Whether those rumors were about disappearances, strange weather, or noises after dark didn't matter. The truth was less important than the reputation that in the north of England. One local council attempted to hire 2 armed guards to stand by a town bridge at night, not to protect it from robbers, but to reassure citizens that it was safe to cross. In the records, the explanation was simply, the bridge must be tamed. No further detail. But the implication was clear. Bridges weren't just physical structures. They had personalities, tempers, moods. You didn't just cross a bridge. You negotiated with it. And sometimes it said no. Interestingly, this fear wasn't exclusive to old bridges. Even newly built crossings, strong, engineered, expensive, were often met with skepticism. When a new bridge was constructed in Bohemia in 1398, the villagers, who had petitioned for it, refused to use it once it was completed. Travelers said they felt cold upon approaching it, or that the water below spoke when the wind came from the west. Builders were furious. Local officials tried hosting a celebration to bless the bridge. Few came. For years, it stood mostly empty. Eventually, moss and vines took over. No accident ever occurred there. But still, no one crossed at night. The fear doubled. Few dared to cross a bridge after sundown. In some communities, it was forbidden. Others left warning signs, stones stacked in strange patterns, cloth tied to nearby trees. to signal that the bridge should not be approached. These markers were not official, but widely understood. When you saw them, you turned back. The emotional weight of these structures was so great that even experienced travelers, like traders and wagon drivers, had specific routines before crossing. Some touched the wood 3 times. Others spit into the water or paused to listen for a moment of silence. These gestures weren't written down. They weren't superstition in the formal sense, but they were serious. You didn't joke about the bridge. You didn't rush across. You didn't look over the edge unless you had to. What's important to understand is that these fears weren't childish or irrational by the standards of the time. In fact, they were rooted in logic as much as imagination. Bridges did collapse. People did disappear. The rivers below were powerful. And when you lived in a world where so much was uncertain, where war, famine, and plague could arrive without warning, the idea that something as solid as a bridge might turn against you didn't feel ridiculous. It felt consistent with the rest of your world. Over time, bridges became part of a silent social contract. They were necessary, but not trusted. Feared, but respected. You didn't build one lightly. You didn't cross one casually. And if you ever found yourself on one, alone, hearing the creak of wood and the rush of dark water below, you didn't ask questions. You just walked faster and hoped it would let you pass. To truly understand why bridges caused such deep unease in the Middle Ages, you have to look beyond just the physical dangers or the practical difficulties. The real fear was rooted in how medieval people experienced space, boundaries, and the unknown. A bridge, for them, was not just a way over water. It was a break in continuity. A place where the world stopped behaving the way it was supposed to. In medieval daily life, most things were defined by limits. Villages had clear edges. Houses had low ceilings and narrow rooms. Paths were carved through fields and forests with deliberate routine. Movement was often circular. People returned to the same places, passed the same landmarks, knew every corner of the roads between home and market. Familiarity created safety. Repetition created meaning. A bridge broke that. Rhythm, for one thing, the sound changed. On land, footsteps were absorbed by soil, grass, or cobble. But on a bridge, especially a wooden one, your own steps echoed back at you, louder than expected. Horse hooves sounded sharper. Carts rattled with an unnatural clatter. And beneath, it all was water, always moving, often loud, sometimes rushing hard enough to drown out voices. You weren't just crossing terrain. You were surrounded by noise you couldn't control. That alone was enough to make many people uneasy. Then there was the light. Bridges were often exposed. No cover, no trees, no walls. On a bright day, the glare off water could be blinding. On cloudy days, the water made everything darker. At night, bridges became black voids, the edges swallowed in shadow. Many had no railings or only crude barriers. A wrong step could be fatal. And yet, even with all this sensory discomfort, the most powerful fear came from what bridges symbolized in the medieval world: transitions. Not just transitions of space, but of identity, of meaning. You were in one place, and then suddenly you were in another. That kind of change didn't sit easily with people who measured time by harvests and distance by how long it took to walk. A bridge was a shortcut, but in a world where shortcuts were often dangerous, that made it suspicious. It was almost unnatural to move so quickly from one world to another, especially when crossing a boundary like a river, which often served as the limit of a lord's land, a village's jurisdiction, or even a dialect zone. One step and everything might change. Laws, customs, language. It didn't help that strange things tended to happen at bridges. They were often isolated, set far from town centers, with no one around to witness accidents or arguments. Many real historical incidents, robberies, disappearances, mysterious deaths were recorded as having occurred near bridges. Not because the bridges themselves caused them, but because these places were liminal, unguarded. Anything could happen there, and if something did, there was rarely anyone to help. That absence of oversight only deepened the sense of danger theirs. Also, the psychological fact that bridges force you to trust. Once you step onto one, there's no turning back without consequence. If it's a long bridge over a wide river, you can't pause halfway and change your mind. You have to keep going. The act of crossing demands commitment. And in a time when so much of life was about caution, hesitation, and waiting for the right moment, that kind of forced momentum made people feel vulnerable, especially when the water underneath was fast and deep and the bridge creaked with every step. There's evidence from estate ledgers and community records that entire groups of travelers would wait for someone else to go first. Caravans paused for hours at a bridge crossing, even if the weather was good and the structure looked sound. That hesitancy wasn't just politeness, it was fear. Someone always had to be the one to test the path. And if that person made it safely across, others would follow, sometimes slowly, one at a time, still watching for signs of collapse or omen. Even the maintenance of bridges was affected by this mindset. In many regions, the responsibility for bridge upkeep was passed around like a burden. No one wanted to claim full ownership. Local lords delegated it to towns. Towns tried to delegate it to traveling merchants. In one bizarre case from 14th century, Bavaria, a town built a bridge and then claimed it belonged to no one. When it fell into disrepair and collapsed, injuring 2 traders, the council argued that since no one officially owned the bridge, no one could be blamed. It was just a structure that had taken its own course. As the phrasing went, that language is telling. Bridges were sometimes talked about not as objects, but as forces, things with will, with behavior. This wasn't necessarily supernatural. It was more like personification born out of respect. When something could change your fate so quickly, you treated it like a presence. You didn't speak ill of a bridge before crossing it. You didn't boast about having crossed one easily. If a bridge held during a storm, you quietly acknowledged it and moved on. All this contributed to the bridge becoming more than just a structure. It became a kind of test, not just of courage, but of readiness. Are you sure you want to leave this place? Are you prepared for what comes next? If you weren't, the bridge would remind you, through sound, movement, or simple unease, that returning was not always an option. By the late medieval period, some of this fear began to shift. Engineering improved. Stone bridges became more common. Guardrails, arches, and wider spans made crossings feel safer. But the emotional reaction didn't disappear overnight. Even in 15th century travel journals, you find careful descriptions of crossings, who went first, how long it took, whether the water was loud, whether the horses hesitated. People were still writing about bridges not just as waypoints, but as characters in the journey. Sometimes the most ink was spent describing a single bridge, while cities and inns barely got a line. That tells you everything. The bridge wasn't just part of the road. It was the story, and for anyone in the medieval world, crossing one was never just a step forward. It was an encounter with uncertainty wrapped in wood and stone. As the Middle Ages wore on, something strange happened with certain bridges across Europe. They started to develop reputations. Not architectural ones, but personalities. Some crossings were called kind or safe. Others were whispered about in nearby taverns as unlucky or restless. These weren't formal titles. They were passed by word of mouth, scrawled in travel diaries, or muttered by cart drivers as they approached with tension in their shoulders. And the odd thing was, these reputations stuck. One stone bridge in southern France, for example, was considered touchy. That's the word that appears in several merchant records. Irritable bridge, crossed with care. Travelers insisted that it shifted underfoot, even when it hadn't rained. One man wrote that oxen refuse it, even when the grain is piled high. It didn't collapse, wasn't damaged, and showed no cracks, but it made people uncomfortable. So they treated it cautiously, offering no loud talk or sudden movements. And when accidents happened nearby, whether a broken axle or a dropped parcel, someone always blamed the bridge's temper. How does a structure get a reputation like that? In medieval culture, people noticed patterns. If something bad happened twice in the same place, it wasn't seen as coincidence. It was seen as a warning, a kind of memory. And if something happened 3 times, it became a rule. Places, especially isolated ones like bridges, were seen not just as passive terrain, but as active participants in human experience. If a bridge seemed to witness too much, people started to believe it could remember too. This belief shaped how people approached certain crossings. In parts of Central Europe, there are records of travelers tapping the posts or beams of certain bridges with sticks before stepping onto them, not to test the strength, but to announce themselves. In northern Italy, there are 2 instances of men removing their hats before crossing a particular wooden bridge, not in prayer, but in acknowledgement. In both cases, it's written that the bridge had not forgotten, though what exactly it remembered is never stated. These habits may sound like superstition, but in context, they made sense. Most bridges weren't owned by any single entity. They didn't have caretakers. They didn't have signs or instructions. So people filled that absence with behavior, customs, repetitions that felt like protection. And the bridges that had seen too much, too many storms, too many disputes, too many travelers who didn't return, became marked. Not officially, but emotionally. Interestingly, not all reputations were negative. Some bridges were believed to be lucky, especially those that had withstood disasters. A few bridges in the Low Countries, for example, were spared during floods that wiped out surrounding roads. Travelers began to leave pebbles at the ends of those bridges, a way of adding weight to the structure's endurance. It wasn't about superstition so much as it was acknowledgement. The bridge had held. The bridge deserved respect. That idea of respecting a structure is easy to overlook in the modern day, where infrastructure is abundant, regulated, and anonymous. But in the Middle Ages, a bridge wasn't just part of the landscape. It was a character. And just like any character, it could be trustworthy or temperamental, silent or strange. People didn't fear bridges only because of the physical danger. They feared them because they felt watched, judged, weighed by the place itself. There's a recorded account from 1391 of a woman who refused to cross a particular bridge after witnessing a brawl on it years before. She wasn't involved in the fight. She didn't even know the men. But the memory of that event was enough to brand the bridge as unsettled. When pressed, she said only, "It isn't the boards or the stone. It's the moment that stayed." That sentence captures something powerful. The medieval mind didn't separate structure from story. If something happened at a bridge, whether a death, a betrayal, or a strange event, it clung to the place, became part of it. And those who crossed afterward didn't just cross space. They crossed history. Some bridges carried those histories so strongly that local children were told to avoid them, even in daylight. Not because they were haunted, but because they were charged. The weight of what had happened there made people uneasy, made silence fall, made dogs hesitate. You didn't cross unless you had to. And when you did it quickly, without speaking, without looking down too long at the water, without asking too many questions. Even today, in some rural parts of Europe, you can find bridges that are whispered about in similar ways. Bad place. Not right. Never dry. Underneath, the details have faded. The facts are gone, but the feeling remains. A kind of memory held not in books or ledgers, but in behavior, because bridges in the Middle Ages weren't just tools. They were thresholds, places that tested the spirit, asked you to confront unease, and sometimes left you with the quiet certainty that something noticed you crossing. And sometimes, that's all it took for fear to take hold. To be stuck near a river in the Middle Ages with no completed bridge in sight was more than just inconvenient. It was unsettling. For many medieval people, the half-built bridge became a symbol of uncertainty. It was a structure that promised safety but offered none. It stood somewhere between use and danger, civilization and nature, land and water. And that middle space, the in-between, was where fear often lived. Imagine a stone bridge under construction in 1280s England. The piers are in place. Maybe a few arches have formed, but the path across is broken. Workers come and go during the day, but at night, the site is abandoned. In the moonlight, its incomplete shape casts strange shadows on the water. Carts are rerouted. Travelers are warned to go miles out of the way, not because the workers failed, but because the bridge itself isn't ready. And that unreadiness made people wary. Unfinished bridges developed a certain silence around them. People avoided camping near them. They didn't build shrines or markers. They didn't talk loudly in their presence. One chronicler from a Flemish town wrote of an incomplete wooden bridge as the structure that listens but never carries. It's an odd phrase, but it reflects a larger idea, that something could be watching, judging whether someone dared to cross before it was truly safe. In cities, unfinished bridges were political symbols. In Paris and Florence, for instance, delayed construction was seen as a public embarrassment. Local leaders feared the unrest that might spread if people thought their bridge wouldn't be finished before the next flood season. And rightly so. When a half-built bridge collapsed during construction in Cologne, workers weren't just blamed, they were shunned. One of them wrote later that it was not the fall that cursed us, but the river's refusal to wait. That idea, that rivers held a kind of judgment, only amplified the fear around incomplete crossings. People spoke of bridges the river didn't want. These were usually sites where construction had failed repeatedly due to floods, frost heave, war, or mysterious structural issues. There are at least 9 records in Central Europe of bridges that were started multiple times over decades, but never completed. Eventually, the landowners gave up, and locals stopped speaking of the project entirely. It wasn't just a failed endeavor. It became a place not to ask about. Some of the unease came from practical reasons. Half-built bridges often had deep pits, wooden scaffolding, exposed nails, and loose stones. They were accidents waiting to happen, but the deeper fear was psychological. A finished bridge offers clarity. You can cross or not. An unfinished one offers uncertainty. Do you wait? Try to ford the river instead? Trust a local ferry, if one even exists? The in-between state placed the traveler in a test, not just of physical balance, but of judgment. And judgment was a big deal in a world where decisions could mean life or death. Choosing the wrong crossing point in spring could leave you stranded for days. Choosing to try an incomplete bridge in winter could mean a fall into freezing water. And word traveled. One tale from southern Italy tells of a young woman who tried to walk across a plankway that wasn't ready. She didn't drown. She didn't break any bones. But she came back, changed, silent, eyes downcast. Her neighbors said she brought the river back in her. Even ferrymen avoided operating too close to half-built bridges. In some towns, bylaws specifically prohibited docking within 20 feet of a bridge under construction. It wasn't just about safety. It was about respect for the effort, the danger, and the idea that this place wasn't whole yet. You didn't interfere. You didn't linger. In modern times, we might look at construction sites as neutral, technical places. But in the medieval mindset, these places had mood. Incomplete bridges were like unhealed wounds in the landscape, open, vulnerable, and unpredictable. And so, fear naturally formed around them. Not loud panic, but the quieter kind of fear. The kind that makes you quicken your pace. That makes you keep your eyes forward. That makes you mutter something under your breath without even realizing it. Because in the Middle Ages, what was incomplete wasn't just inconvenient. It was unnatural. And Few things unsettled medieval people more than something that wasn't finished but refused to fall. Some medieval bridges had a reputation, not because of what you could see, but what you could hear. That it wasn't just the wind or the rush of water beneath the arches. It was a specific sound, sometimes a hum, sometimes a groan, sometimes a low whistling that seemed to come from within the bridge itself. And when people heard it, especially after sundown, they did the simplest, oldest thing humans do in the face of something they don't understand. They turned around. There are records from 13th century England and northern Italy that describe bridges as being alive with sound, not in a joyful sense, not like music, but with something almost aware. A report from a merchant who crossed a narrow stone bridge near Lyon in 1296 says, "It gave a breath beneath me, as if it knew I was there." He never crossed that way again. In some regions, people didn't call these noises strange, they called them warnings. Engineers today might attribute these sounds to the compression and release of wooden supports, or the vibrations of stone under pressure from water and wind. But to medieval people, a bridge that sang in the dark wasn't just faulty. It was resisting use. The bridge over the Dina in the Balkans was one such place. Travelers claimed that after heavy rains, it would emit a rhythmic moaning sound from its central pillar. Some believed it was due to erosion or minor collapses deep within its base. Others believed it was a form of protest, that the bridge had been overused, disrespected, or built on land that didn't want it. Local children were warned not to linger near it, especially after twilight. Not because it might collapse, but because you might hear it decide. But the fear wasn't always about supernatural awareness. Sometimes it was much simpler. People feared that sound meant weakness. A silent bridge was a safe bridge, one that groaned in the wind or echoed oddly underfoot was a risk. And in a world without modern diagnostics, the only warning sign of a bridge ready to fail was the noise it made before it did. That's why silence was built into the culture of bridge crossings. Travelers walked quietly across. Horses were slowed. Wheels were padded with cloth. In parts of Central Europe, there were even informal codes, like tapping the stones with a stick before placing full weight, or crossing one at a time, not in groups. But despite these precautions, stories still spread. A bridge in Wales known locally as the Whisperer was avoided by livestock drivers after a series of sheep refused to walk its length. No one knew why. The structure held, but something about it made animals balk. The humans soon followed suit. This subtle dread often accumulated over generations. A bridge that was fine to cross by day might become taboo at night, not because anything had happened, but because people had absorbed the habit of avoidance. And in medieval life, habits were powerful. They formed the rhythm of survival. Even in cities where bridges were sturdier and better maintained, stories circulated. The Ponte Rotto in Rome was described as the singing under the weight of noblemen's boots. Some attributed the sound to the river pushing against the arches. Others thought it was the sound of all the men who'd fallen into the water over the centuries, still echoing in the stone. Of course, fear of sound wasn't unique to bridges. But bridges were different because they were not static. They were active thresholds. You had to walk them, trust them, and once you were on them, there was no going back quickly. If a bridge began to creak or groan when you were halfway across, it wasn't just unsettling. It was isolating. In the Middle Ages, people didn't always need proof to fear something. They needed memory. If someone had fallen, if a wagon had vanished, if a brother had drowned, those stories echoed louder than any official declaration of safety. And once sound became associated with tragedy, it was enough. One anonymous monk, writing in the margins of a prayer book in the 14th century, scribbled this note: "The bridge sang today. No one crossed afternoon." He didn't explain further. He didn't have to. In the medieval world, the idea that a structure could simply vanish overnight wasn't seen as impossible. It was seen as a possibility that no one wanted to talk about, especially when it came to bridges. Not vanish as in stolen or magically erased, but gone in the more terrifying way. Collapsed without warning, taken by a flood, or simply no longer where it was supposed to be. And when a bridge disappeared, the fear didn't end with the loss. It started there, across the Alpine passes of medieval Switzerland. There are records of travelers arriving at known river crossings only to find nothing. The guidebook or village elder had told them there would be a bridge. Sometimes there had been one just days earlier. But now, only a river remained, raging, fast, wide. No signs of planks, no ropes, no beams. Just a current and silence. Sometimes, the stones where the bridge had been anchored were bare, as if no structure had ever existed. This was not common, but it was not unheard of. And every time it happened, the reaction was the same. People turned around. They didn't try to build a raft. They didn't attempt to swim. They simply went back. Why? Because if a bridge could vanish, it meant something had claimed it. Nature, time, or something else. In the absence of explanation, medieval minds filled the space with caution. In Burgundy, the Charentonnet crossing was one of the most infamous cases. It had been maintained by local farmers and traders, passed from generation to generation. It wasn't large, but it was vital. It connected 3 towns and was used almost daily. Then one morning in early winter, it was gone. Not washed away, just missing. The wooden beams were nowhere. No wreckage, no debris downstream. For months, people refused to even talk about rebuilding it. Some said the river had become restless. Others claimed it was an omen, a punishment for overuse. One family moved away entirely. The bridge was never rebuilt. The path was rerouted miles upstream. Even though the new crossing was steeper, colder, and less reliable, fear doesn't always come from what people see. Sometimes it comes from what they expected to see and didn't. In England, during the early 1300s, there's mention of a ghost bridge outside a small town in Devon. According to town records and tax rolls, the crossing had been used for decades, perhaps centuries. But after a storm, one that wasn't especially severe, it stopped being visible. Locals claimed that sometimes, from a distance, you could still see the bridge, the outline, the supports. But if you approached, there was nothing, just empty water. At first, people thought it was mist, then madness. But the fear grew so strong that the river itself was given a new name, Blackmouth. No one used that crossing again. This wasn't about fantasy or magic. It was about trust. Bridges in the Middle Ages weren't just tools. They were contracts between humans and the natural world. We build this thing. You stay still long enough for us to cross. When that contract was broken without warning, it undermined more than travel. It shook people's sense of reality. The engineering knowledge at the time couldn't always explain structural failure. When a bridge collapsed, it was often attributed to bad placement, old wood, all vague, insufficient answers. But a bridge simply missing? No ruins, no splinters, no fallen beams. That was something else. It raised questions no one wanted to answer. What if it hadn't broken? What if it had been taken? Even today, some remote areas in Europe have tales of the stolen bridge, not literally stolen by thieves, but by forces that do not leave tracks. In these stories, it's not the act of crossing that brings doom, it's the attempt to cross. The moment someone approaches, the bridge fails them, or disappears beneath their feet, or never existed at all. Back then, oral tradition was stronger than official accounts. If enough people said a bridge had vanished, then it had. Whether or not the timber was found downstream didn't matter. Memory was more real than evidence. And once a bridge was labeled unreliable, its fate was sealed, even if it returned. Yes, in some places, bridges were rebuilt after disappearances, but they were never used the same way. Pilgrims found detours. Traders paid for longer routes. Even when rebuilt stronger and newer, These crossings carried the stain of uncertainty. And in a time when every journey was a risk, no one wanted to add uncertainty to the list. People in the Middle Ages didn't have the luxury of trust without reason. They trusted paths that held firm, rivers that ran predictable, structures that stayed in place. A vanishing bridge broke that fragile framework, and so they were avoided, rewritten in local maps, erased from memory. Because to keep speaking about a place where the ground once betrayed you was to invite doubt. And doubt was dangerous. That's why, to this day, some of the most infamous bridges in medieval lore aren't the haunted ones. Not the cursed or bloodstained or battlefield-adjacent ones. They're the ones that should have been there, but weren't. In modern thinking, a bridge is a means to an end. You use it to get from one side to the other. Nothing more. But in the Middle Ages, bridges sometimes were the destination or the mystery. Some crossings weren't built just to span rivers. They were intentionally designed as places where people were meant to stop, not pass. And that alone made them unsettling. There were bridges that were deliberately wide in the middle, with alcoves or niches built into the stonework. Not for engineering reasons, but for pausing. Places where travelers would light candles, leave tokens, pray, or, more often, wait. For what? No one ever gave a straight answer. In Italy, several medieval stone bridges still exist that have odd, flat expanses in the center, wide enough for small gatherings, yet without railings or protective walls. Some believe these spaces were for toll collectors or guards, but in many cases, no historical record exists to explain them. The flat midsections were not fortified, not covered, and often exposed to wind and weather. And yet, locals insisted they were necessary. You don't cross a bridge in a single breath, one Tuscan proverb warned. You give it time to notice you. This idea of the bridge as a presence, something with the kind of awareness, runs counter to how we view infrastructure today. But back then, people understood bridges as thresholds, not tools. And thresholds, by definition, demand respect. In Brittany and parts of Wales, some bridges had stones set deliberately out of alignment in their center sections. They weren't dangerous, just odd. The ground would feel slightly off beneath your feet. Sometimes the pitch of the surface changed subtly. Walking across, people often slowed, turned, or even hesitated without meaning to. The feeling of wrongness was small but consistent, enough to make people cross in silence. In London, old accounts of the medieval London Bridge describe how people avoided stopping in the center, especially at dusk. Despite the stalls, despite the presence of homes and shops along the bridge, there was a superstition. The middle sees everything. It wasn't a phrase of poetry, it was a warning. People believed the central span of long bridges had a kind of memory, that they absorbed the weight, words, and intentions of every traveler. And over time, that memory built up like tension, in wood ready to snap. There are even stories, never written formally, but told and retold, of people who crossed a bridge too quickly or with the wrong intentions and didn't feel the same afterward. Not cursed, not harmed, just unsettled, like something had taken notice. One account from Bohemia speaks of a merchant who crossed a bridge during a thunderstorm to reach a village before nightfall. He made it, but refused to return by the same route. The next day, the wind changed, he reportedly said, but the bridge did not. He spent weeks traveling far out of his way rather than cross it again. This wasn't about engineering. It was about trusting silence. In the medieval world, you noticed when something was too quiet. You paid attention when a place didn't feel quite right. And bridges, suspended above moving water, open to the sky, disconnected from land, were the perfect stage for that unease. Some bridges gained reputations not because of what happened on them, but because of what didn't. No one laughed while crossing. No one sang. Animals grew nervous at their approach. Horses slowed. Dogs barked at empty space. And people, even if they didn't say it aloud, crossed faster on the return journey to in a handful of documents from the Low Countries. There are references to talking bridges, not in the sense of literal voices, but in how they seem to respond to people's presence. A slight groan of wood underfoot, a stone echoing too long, a shift in air pressure right in the center span. These were subtle cues, but in an era without scientific explanation, subtle cues mattered. People didn't need a bridge to shout at them, they just needed it to feel wrong. And then, there were the single-use bridges in some rural regions, especially in the Balkans. There are accounts of temporary wooden bridges built only for specific events, funerals, weddings, or major trades. These bridges weren't meant to last. They were built, used once, and disassembled or burned. Not because they were poorly constructed, but because keeping them was seen as inviting repetition. If a funeral crossed a bridge, no one wanted that. Bridge to remember and bring another. Some chroniclers mention that the most feared crossings weren't the oldest, creakiest, or most worn. They were the ones that had recently witnessed change, a sudden flood, a violent argument, an unexpected death. Events that felt out of balance. After something like that, the bridge wasn't just a bridge anymore. It was a place where something happened, and that was enough for people to avoid it. Ultimately, medieval fear of bridges wasn't just about falling, crumbling, or collapsing. It was about what bridges represented, transitions that couldn't be undone. Once you crossed, you were somewhere else, maybe someone else. And in a world where certainty was rare, that shift, small, silent, but undeniable, was enough to make people afraid, not terrified, not frozen, but wary, because bridges, unlike roads or tunnels, don't just take you somewhere. They take you away from where you were, and in the deep, quiet parts of the medieval mind that made every crossing, especially the empty, windswept ones, just a little too alive. In the vast tapestry of medieval Europe, not all bridges were built with practical purpose. Some, especially in rural or mountainous regions, had no clear destination. They spanned a stream, a ravine, a narrow river, and yet, on the other side, there was nothing. No road, no village, no farmland, just trees or cliffs or open space. These were known, quietly and without fanfare, as dead bridges. They weren't ruins. Many were intact, well built even by the standards of the time. But their function had either been lost to history or never truly existed. Some may have been built for access to long-abandoned settlements or waypoints that simply disappeared. Others may have been private commissions, created by nobles or landowners for their own purposes and then forgotten. But among locals, a different explanation often took root. These were bridges that weren't built for people. That phrase appears in scattered regional writings and oral folklore from the 11th to 14th centuries. In places like the Carpathians, rural Normandy, and parts of Galicia, travelers were warned not to cross a bridge unless they knew where it led. Not because they'd get lost, but because you don't belong on someone else's path. A bridge to nowhere didn't just confuse people. It made them nervous. And in communities where direction and intention mattered, where your purpose for walking a road was as important as your destination, these structures were anomalies. They broke the rules. Some villagers called them found bridges. You discovered that weren't marked on any local map, weren't mentioned in travel routes, and weren't built by anyone still living nearby. These were avoided out of a sense of quiet deference, not fear of collapse, not even fear of haunting, just the strong, shared belief that if no one uses it, there's a reason. In one tale from southern Austria, a hunter comes across a stone bridge deep in the woods. No roads lead to it, no signs. It spans a dry gully, but on the other side is only dense forest. Curious, the hunter crosses. He's never seen again. The story ends not with screams or sightings, but with a single line. He chose a road that wasn't his. This motif repeats itself across Europe. Silent bridges. Forgotten spans, structures intact, yet untouched. And often, when someone did attempt to cross, they returned changed. Not injured, not visibly disturbed, but quieter, more withdrawn, as if they'd seen something that couldn't be shared. In some places, these bridges became unofficial boundaries. Villagers wouldn't farm near them. Children weren't allowed to play nearby. If a herd of animals crossed one accidentally, it was seen as a bad omen, not because the livestock were lost, but because they'd gone where they weren't welcome. Interestingly, monks and traveling clergy sometimes treated these bridges with a kind of ritual caution. In journals from a few isolated abbeys, there are entries describing bridges without claim. These were approached slowly, crossed with a prayer, or even sprinkled with holy water, not out of dogma, but because, as one friar put it, stone laid without purpose answers only to time. Engineers today might suggest these were remnants of planned roads that were never completed. That is likely true, but for the medieval mind, practical explanations didn't always offer comfort. What mattered wasn't how the bridge was built, it was how it felt. And a bridge that felt wrong, that demanded attention, that stood silently, untouched for generations, that kind of bridge was dangerous in its own way. Not because it threatened your life, but because it challenged your certainty. You couldn't ask who built it. You couldn't ask where it went. You could only stand before it, feel the wind shift, and decide whether to cross something that clearly didn't need you. Most medieval bridges were simple. Wooden planks, stone arches, maybe iron supports if you were in a well-off town or near a monastery with resources. But no matter the material, bridges had one thing in common that made them subtly terrifying. To the people who used them, they made noise. This wasn't about structural creaking or the splashing of water. Those were expected. This was different. It was the echo, the strange vibration of footsteps that sounded distorted, slowed, hollow in a way that didn't match the surface. People described it in different ways. Some said it felt like the bridge was repeating their step a second or two later. Others insisted that something was walking beneath them, but just slightly out of sync. Not mimicking, just following, slightly offbeat, and always silent until you moved. In northern England, there was an old superstition among shepherds, who occasionally needed to cross long stone bridges at dusk. They believed that if your own footstep echoed louder on the third plank than the first or second, something had noticed you. Not necessarily something malicious, just aware. The phrase, often used in oral stories, was, "The bridge is awake." There were even customs to avoid this. People would pause briefly after their third step, look down, and mutter a short phrase, usually something mundane, like a sheep count or a weather comet. The idea was to ground the mind, prove you were still in your own world, not slipping into someone else's rhythm. Some bridges became known for their sounds, not the location, not the shape, just the strange way they answered motion. One chronicler from 1291 describes a wooden bridge near the town of Tarascon that produced a hollow that did not suit its grain. He refused to cross it alone, saying it was like walking over a question. Over time, a few of these bridges developed reputations as places to avoid at night, even if they were safe during the day. It wasn't about bandits or wolves. It was about not wanting to hear what the bridge had to say. Because in the silence of late evening, when torches flickered and the wind stopped, a single echo underfoot could sound like more than wood. It could sound like memory, like someone else's pace coming from somewhere far older than your OW into in fishing towns along the western coast of Ireland. There were tales of bridges where no one spoke while crossing. Not a word, not a cough. Even children were shushed. The belief wasn't based on legend. It was based on pattern. People who spoke aloud while on the bridge tended to forget what they said, or remembered it differently. A fisherman once claimed he told a joke halfway across, and reached the end of the bridge weeping. He couldn't explain why. Other accounts spoke of horses that refused to walk certain spans, particularly at dusk or dawn. They'd freeze, stiffen, Their ears alert, their breath sharp. Not always afraid, just unusually aware. As if the bridge made them feel something. More than one medieval horseman made note of the pause, that brief, haunting moment when even the most loyal mount wouldn't take the next step. And it wasn't just noise. It was the absence of it. There were bridges known for swallowing sound. A cart's wheels would suddenly grow muffled halfway across. Voices would feel trapped in the throat. Bells on a collar or a belt would seem to go silent. For a society so attuned to the texture of sound, wood on stone, wind in trees, the clang of metal, this void was unsettling. It made people doubt their presence. You walked across, and for a few seconds, it felt like you didn't exist. Point 1. Merchants log from 1338 notes a bridge near Linz where he claimed the world forgot you, until you stepped back onto Earth. He said crossing it felt like stepping out of time, and he made sure never to cross it again. Of course, in many cases, this was just acoustics. Architecture, material reacting to weather. But in an age when most people lived in tight, echoless homes, to walk a bridge that spoke back was to experience a different kind of space. A space that wasn't yours. A space where your presence felt borrowed. So the fear wasn't that a bridge would collapse, or trap you, or even lead you somewhere dangerous. The fear was quieter. It was the fear that while crossing, you would hear something that remembered everyone who'd crossed before you. That every step might stir something listening, not from below, but from between, and that maybe, just maybe, it would remember you, too. In the medieval world, bridges weren't just architectural feats. They were social, psychological, and sometimes emotional crossings. But there was another kind of weight they carried, one that didn't involve superstition or ghostly echoes. A cost that wasn't measured in coins, but in silence, memory, and perception. Because to cross a bridge in the Middle Ages was to pay a toll, even when no one asked for money. First, there were the physical tolls, of course. Many bridges were maintained by lords, monasteries, or merchant guilds. They had every reason to collect a fee from those who used them, especially in areas where crossing a river without a bridge was dangerous or impossible for most of the year. In southern France, there were bridges where even peasants crossing on foot were expected to leave a token, an egg, a scrap of cloth, or even a whispered promise to speak well of the keeper. Some tolls weren't material at all. They were performative. A bow, a recitation, a small gesture to acknowledge that the bridge belonged to someone or something. But even where no fee was demanded, travelers often crossed with hesitation, not out of fear, but out of a sense of cost. Crossing a bridge meant leaving one space behind and entering another. It meant transition. And in the medieval world, transitions were rarely neutral. Every shift had weight. Every border had a meaning. You left the village and its customs and entered the forest or another lord's domain or the road to nowhere. The bridge was the moment you knew you were no longer where you'd been. That carried more burden than most people today imagine. In letters from traveling monks in the 13th century, you find passages not about the destination, but the crossing. A monk in northern Italy wrote of a narrow bridge over a dry gully. I felt I had not just left soil, but sense. The air after it was other. Another, traveling from Rouen to Chartres, described a bridge crossing as a shutter closing behind me, though I heard no sound. There were also psychological tolls. People who crossed bridges alone at night were often treated with a hint of suspicion, not because they were doing something illegal, but because such an act implied desperation, or secrecy, or grief. What would drive someone to cross at that hour? What thoughts would they carry? What burdens might they spill into the wind halfway across? One old superstition in Poland held that you should never meet someone in the middle of a bridge. If you saw a traveler approaching, either let them cross completely or wait until they passed the midpoint. Meeting in the center, where water surrounded you on all sides, was thought to invite confusion of the soul. People might forget their name, or where they were going, or begin telling truths they didn't mean to share. Children were often told stories of the midspan whisper, a tale of someone who spoke their secrets aloud in the middle of the bridge, thinking no one could hear, only to find those secrets echoed back to them in a stranger's voice years later. There were emotional tolls, too. Some bridges had reputations not for danger, but for evoking feelings that didn't belong. A merchant in Cologne once wrote of a stone bridge that made him cry every time he crossed it. He couldn't explain why. No one had died there. No tragedy tied to it. Just a strange, pressing sorrow that came and left in the time it took to cross. The townsfolk didn't find that strange. They just nodded. The bridge remembers. They said that in other cases, bridges became places people avoided not because of fear, but because of memories. That was the bridge where someone left, where someone said goodbye, where a fight happened, where a silence stretched too long. Medieval bridges didn't just span water, they gathered stories. And because people didn't move as frequently back then, the emotional fingerprints on those stones lingered. You might walk the same path every week, and each time be reminded of something you didn't mean to recall. Some bridge builders knew this. In several towns across what is now Germany and Switzerland, guilds deliberately built side rails or crossing stones that allowed people to avoid the exact middle. Not for safety, but for peace of mind. To give them a way to cross without walking through memory. There's even an account of a small bridge near Bruges where the locals added an archway of carved wood, not for structure, but to block the view of the center. It became known as the Forgetting Bridge. Some said if you crossed it with your eyes closed and held your breath, you'd forget what hurt you most. Others said it just helped with focus. But no matter the version, people believed the act of crossing had weight and needed help. In the end, medieval people didn't fear bridges because they were rickety or haunted or unsafe. They feared them because bridges asked for more than footsteps. They asked for attention, for memory, for vulnerability. And whether or not they gave you something in return, that was never guaranteed, because some crossings left you heavier, not lighter, and that was the toll no one warned you about. In the vast stretch of medieval time, centuries where the average person rarely traveled far from their birthplace, bridges became some of the few places where lives intersected, literally and metaphorically. In cities, bridges were often the only shared structure between neighborhoods, parishes, or social classes. In rural areas, they were the single connection between isolation and contact, village and trade route, known and unknown. Over time, this made bridges into more than just passageways. They became repositories of human behavior, places where all manner of things occurred, silently absorbed by the stone, that it's easy to think of medieval bridges as just engineering. Arches, spans, weight ratios. But to those who walked them, they were as alive as any town square. Not in the supernatural sense, but in the emotional accumulation of memory. If you crossed a bridge every market day and passed the same neighbor, that bridge became a place of routine. If one day that neighbor wasn't there, it became a place of loss. If you met your love on a bridge or had your final word with a rival there, that span held the echo of it. Medieval people had a word for this in some regions, not in Latin, but in local dialects. In parts of Occident France, the phrase loss, ponts parlantes, the talking bridges, referred not to haunted places, but to bridges that seemed to evoke emotion or recollection without a word being said. They weren't feared, but they weren't trusted to be neutral either. Travelers sometimes reported an odd mood coming over them mid-crossing. Not terror, not joy, something quieter, reflective. A Flemish manuscript from 1362 includes a merchant's note. Crossing the West Bridge, I felt myself less hurried, my memory unfastened. I thought of old things without bidding. In an age where life was noisy in its own rural way, animals, carts, bells, shouting, bridges created a break in. The rhythm, the sound of feet on stone, the pause to look at water. The momentary disconnection from fields or houses or streets. In that liminal moment, people often became reflective whether they meant to or not. And reflection, in the medieval world, was not always welcome. Many people feared excessive introspection. It was associated with melancholy, a humoral imbalance thought to invite sickness or madness. Spending too much time alone with your thoughts, especially on a bridge, especially above moving water, was viewed with suspicion. There are scattered records of individuals being pulled back from bridge rails not because they were suicidal, in the modern sense, but because people believed standing too long on a bridge could unmoor your sense of reality. The idea was not that the bridge would do anything, but that it might remind you too sharply of something you'd pushed away. This is why many communities developed bridge etiquette. Rules about when to cross, how quickly, where to stop, and what not to say. In parts of rural England, children were told not to tell secrets while crossing a bridge because the water takes words away, but sometimes it brings them back. In parts of Denmark, lovers were discouraged from confessing affections on bridges. It was thought those feelings would become trapped, echoing back later in unwanted moments. Even traders and traveling performers, who crossed hundreds of bridges in their lives, often developed personal rituals for bridge crossings. Some knocked once on the rail with their knuckles. Some spat gently into the river. Some avoided looking down entirely. This may sound irrational to modern ears, but it points to something deeply human. The recognition that some spaces demand respect not because of what they are, but because of what they witness. Medieval people believed that a structure which saw thousands of footsteps, of joy, regret, anger, reconciliation, might somehow carry a residue of those things, and it wasn't just the grand bridges of cities that earned this reverence. Even small wooden footbridges across streams were sometimes spoken of with a tone reserved for churchyards or old wells. In one tale from northern Italy, a young man was warned not to lie while standing on the village's small river bridge on his own. Over time, bridges became silent arbiters of truth and presence. You could not build one without inviting passage, but you also couldn't build one without inviting emotion. They were the medieval world's natural pause buttons, interruptions in space that reminded you to pay attention, whether you wanted to or not. And in an age without therapy, without journaling, without outlets for internal reflection, bridges became one of the only places where you might confront yourself, however briefly, however quietly. That, perhaps, more than superstition or danger, is why people approach them with a mixture of reverence and discomfort, because a bridge did more than take you somewhere. It held you for a moment and asked you to listen. When you picture a medieval bridge, it's easy to imagine a quaint, mossy arch tucked between pastures. But in reality, many of these bridges were gateways of power, and crossing them wasn't free. In fact, one of the most practical reasons people feared bridges had nothing to do with water or superstition. It was about what waited on the other side and who demanded payment. Throughout the Middle Ages, most bridges were not public infrastructure. They were built and maintained by lords, monasteries, city councils, or wealthy patrons. And with ownership came rights, particularly the right to charge a toll. And these tolls were no minor fee. In some regions, the cost of crossing a bridge with a cart could equal a day's wages, or more. This created a persistent tension. Bridges were essential, but exploitable. If you needed to reach market, church, or a neighboring village, and the only bridge in the region belonged to a feudal lord or city-state with sharp toll collectors, you had little choice but to pay, or detour miles out of the way, risking wild terrain and unsafe fords. But tolls weren't the only concern. These bridge checkpoints often became zones of surveillance and control. Soldiers or guards were stationed at key crossings, not just to collect fees, but to monitor movement, enforce curfews, or block undesired travelers. In times of plague, political unrest, or religious crackdown, bridges could be sealed entirely. Whole communities were known to be starved of trade or news because the only bridge to their region had been closed as a form of punishment or containment. So while a bridge might appear open, its passage was never guaranteed in urban centers. Like Paris or Florence, bridges became mini polities, self-contained power nodes. Shops and homes were built directly onto them, and toll keepers lived above the archways they controlled. In some cases, the toll was technically for maintenance of the structure, but in reality, it padded the purse of whoever owned the rights. And disputes over bridge ownership often turned violent. There are records from the 12th to 14th centuries describing entire bridge riots. Townsfolk refusing to pay increased tolls would sometimes storm collection posts, destroy toll logs, or even toss the collector's booth into the river. In return, noble families dispatched armed men to reassert control. Several castles in France and the Low Countries were fortified not because of wars, but because their bridge toll policies had sparked local rebellion. This history made people wary of bridges, not just the structures, but the politics around them. Who really owned the crossing? Were the tolls fair? Were they even legal? Some traveling merchants carried counterfeit tokens, small, forged lead or pewter medallions that mimicked the official toll passes of bridge lords. If caught, they could be fined, imprisoned, or even banned from future crossing. But many risked it, especially in regions where bridges had become known for extortionate fees. These tokens, in a way, became a currency of resistance, proof that bridges were more than geography. They were contested ground, and yet, despite all this tension, bridges remained vital. Some monastic orders saw the dilemma and tried to intervene. In the 11th and 12th centuries, bridge-building brotherhoods emerged in France and parts of Germany. These were religious and charitable groups devoted to constructing and maintaining free bridges, funded by donations and driven by belief. In communal service, they offered safer, toll-free passage. For a while, they thrived, but most of these free bridges were short-lived. Without ongoing funds, they deteriorated. Local lords often absorbed or destroyed them to maintain control of the region's traffic and revenue. And so, for the average person, the choice returned: pay the toll or find another way. This tension made approaching a bridge a moment of uncertainty, not just emotionally, but practically. Would you be charged, delayed, searched, denied? And this uncertainty repeated over generations, embedded itself in the cultural memory of bridges. They weren't just physical structures. They were gates of judgment, each one echoing the mood of those who controlled it in a world where few had autonomy. Even the simple act of crossing to the other side of a river became a negotiation, not just with nature, but with human authority as so. It's no wonder that medieval people approached bridges with suspicion, tension, and sometimes fear, because what lay across the water wasn't always freedom. Sometimes it was just another hand reaching into your pocket. By the late Middle Ages, bridges had taken on a dual identity in the minds of ordinary people. On the one hand, they were essential, brilliant feats of engineering that connected trade routes, towns, and territories. But on the other, they represented something less tangible, yet far more unsettling. They felt like places where you were being watched. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. Across hundreds of towns and regions in Europe, people began to associate bridges with surveillance, judgment, and vulnerability, not because of myth or legend, but because, for centuries, a bridge had often been the only place where authority could reliably monitor a traveler. That on a forest road, you could disappear. On a hill path, you might blend into the crowd. But on a narrow stone bridge, surrounded by water, funneled by walls or railings, you had no choice but to be seen. And that visibility changed behavior. Travelers slowed down at bridges. They looked over their shoulders. They lowered their voices. It became common for merchants or pilgrims to rehearse what they would say before reaching a known checkpoint. Those traveling with goods concealed extra coin in their boots, and those with a secret, an illegal book, a questionable relic, a false identity, often chose to detour miles out of their way just to avoid a certain bridge. This wasn't just fear of tolls anymore. It was a creeping sense that bridges remembered things. And in many towns, they did, because bridges didn't just host toll keepers. They were also the site of public postings, wanted notices, bans, declarations of excommunication, or news of war. In some cases, names were written on the stone or wood itself, a permanent reminder that someone had crossed and never returned, or had tried to bribe their way past the guards. In a few major cities, bridges had scribes stationed near the main arch, recording transactions or movements. Crossing meant being logged. This culture of observation evolved into ceremony. In Italian city-states, diplomats were escorted over, bridges under guard. In parts of Germany, criminals were forced to cross bridges barefoot as penance, watched by the townsfolk as a symbolic exposure. And in parts of Scotland and northern France, duels of honor were sometimes held on bridges. Because there was no retreat, only forward or down, people internalized this. They didn't just fear what might happen on the bridge. They feared what might follow them after crossing it. Old French peasant tales began to speak of the bridge echo, a strange feeling that someone had overheard you mid-crossing, even when no one else was near. English folktales mention long-footed men who remembered those who lied at a toll gate and came for payment years later. In Eastern European oral histories, there are stories of bridges refusing to let someone cross, not physically, but through accidents, delays, strange weather, or sudden illness, as if the bridge itself was judging their intent. Of course, we can interpret these today as metaphors, but at the time, they felt lived and immediate. Bridges, after all, were liminal spaces, neither here nor there. You weren't in one town anymore, but you hadn't reached the next. You were between, and between was always a little dangerous. Monks in the 14th century wrote of bridges as moral thresholds, places where the soul must reflect before passing. A chronicler in Bohemia even compared bridges to confessionals, narrow, deliberate, and revealing. But not all of this fear came from institutions or folklore. Some came from the bridges themselves, because many were not safe. Especially in rural regions or war-torn areas, bridges fell into disrepair. Stones came loose, railings rotted. A bridge might look passable but crumble mid-crossing. Entire families drowned in river crossings that were assumed secure. And once word got around that a bridge had collapsed, it didn't matter if it was. Rebuilt stronger, the memory stayed. And so even when walking across a sturdy, well-kept bridge, people slowed. They tested each step. They clutched children tightly. Because there was always a story of someone who didn't make it. Bridges weren't feared because of one reason. They were feared because they combined every kind of vulnerability: physical, financial, social, psychological. They were places where your feet could slip, your purse could be emptied, your name could be written down, or your intentions questioned. And when you reached the other side, you weren't always sure who had seen you, or what might follow. As strange as it may sound to modern ears, one of the quiet fears that lingered in the hearts of many medieval travelers was not making it back across the bridge they'd just used. Not because they expected war or destruction, but because many bridges in the Middle Ages were understood, culturally, emotionally, as points of no return. There were entire routes where the journey out and the journey back were expected to be different, not just logistically, but philosophically. A bridge could mark the beginning of a pilgrimage, a rite of exile, a departure from one's family or class. And so, even if the same bridge still stood months or years later, the person returning was no longer the same. That alone made people uneasy, But it wasn't all metaphor. In some towns, especially those with narrow or fragile bridges, traffic was one-directional by rule or custom. This was common in Italian hill towns or coastal regions with wooden spans. There were signs, or spoken warnings, from bridge keepers. Once you crossed, you might have to find a different route home. And if that wasn't possible, you waited. Waited for traffic to die down. Waited for permission. Or waited for someone more important to cross first. This enforced patience added tension to every crossing. Bridges were also tied to quarantine and disease. During plague periods or outbreaks of unknown illness, many bridges became guarded checkpoints. Once you left a town across its bridge, you might not be allowed to return, even if your loved ones were inside. The bridge, then, became not just a passage, but a locked gate you could only walk through once. In some recorded cases, especially in France and along the Danube, people were forced to cross bridges alone, with others watching from a safe distance. This wasn't punishment, it was policy. If someone had been in contact with the sick or was suspected of hiding symptoms, they were made to walk alone across the bridge to prove they could reach the other side unaided. Many described it as the longest walk of their life. Children grew up hearing stories of relatives who went over the bridge and never came back. It wasn't a euphemism for death, it was a literal fact. Some never found their way home. Others were turned away by new rules. Some disappeared in conflict. And still others simply chose not to return, changed by what they'd seen on the far side. This idea, the bridge as a final threshold, became embedded in daily language. In southern Italy, to cross the bridge, a traversare il ponte, was sometimes used as a soft way of saying someone had betrayed their village or taken a foreign bride. In the Low Countries, losing the bridge could mean falling out with one's family. And in Slavic folklore, some ballads featured verses where lovers met only on the bridge, suggesting a meeting between two worlds, neither here nor there, and doomed to end. But perhaps the most haunting motif is this: the unfinished return there. Are travel journals and oral accounts from the 13th and 14th centuries that reference people who stood at the mouth of a bridge and could not bring themselves to cross back. They stood, stared, perhaps cried, and eventually turned away. Not because they were being chased or banished or blocked, but because the bridge no longer felt open to them. As if, by crossing once, they had used up their right. It's a strangely modern anxiety, the fear that some choices, even mundane ones, can't be undone. Bridges in the medieval world captured this perfectly. They were solid. They were real. But they carried the weight of everything unseen: regret, memory, change. Even today, in some older villages, when locals refer to an event long past, they say, "That was before the bridge." They don't mean literally. They mean before everything changed. Because in the quiet rhythm of medieval life, crossing a bridge meant stepping into something unknown, and not always being certain the way back would still be there when you turned around. For every legendary bridge that has survived in maps, songs, or ruins, there are dozens more that simply vanished in the medieval imagination. This wasn't just strange, it was terrifying. Because a bridge was more than wood or stone. It was witness. It saw who came and went. It stood between places, and in doing so, it held memory. So when a bridge was suddenly gone, it felt as if a piece of truth had been erased. Some disappearances had logical causes: flooding, sabotage, collapse under too much weight, poor maintenance. But many others were more ambiguous. Entire regions would wake to find a bridge, used just the day before, completely destroyed or missing, with no one claiming responsibility. And when asked what happened, locals would simply shrug and say, "It didn't want to be crossed anymore." That sentence may sound poetic, but in the Middle Ages, it reflected a worldview in which physical objects, bridges, wells, stones, were not just passive structures. They were active participants in daily life. If a bridge had stood for generations and suddenly crumbled for no apparent reason, it was often understood as a message, a sign that something had been ignored, disrespected, or broken, socially, morally, or ritually. In several medieval chronicles from Bavaria and Saxony, the sudden collapse of rural bridges was seen as a community failing. Had travelers not been properly welcomed? Had goods been smuggled across under false weight measures? Had someone been exiled unfairly? When a bridge fell, these were the questions asked. Not, was the structure sound, but what did we do to deserve this? And so, the disappearance of a bridge left people not just stranded, but guilty in remote villages. This guilt could last for generations. New bridges would be proposed, but rarely accepted in the exact same place. Locals would shift the road, curve the path, build higher up or lower down the river, anywhere but on the spot where the old one had fallen. Because that absence meant something. It had been marked by lost. In a few rare cases, makeshift shrines were placed where old bridges had once stood. These were not religious icons, just piles of stones or carved wooden markers. They didn't beg for forgiveness. They simply acknowledged, we remember what was here. Even more unsettling were stories of bridges that disappeared mid-crossing. Point 1. Unsettling account comes from a 14th century traveler's journal found in the archives of Metz. It describes a narrow wooden bridge across a marshy lowland. A group of 6 merchants crossed in the early dawn, with the last man reportedly only a few steps behind the others. When the first 5 reached the other side and turned back, the 6th was gone, and so was the span of the bridge behind him. Only open water. No splash, no broken boards. Just silence. They waited all day. He never reappeared. The bridge was never rebuilt. Locals avoided the area for decades. Such stories didn't spread far, because people didn't want to repeat them. Speaking of a hungry bridge, or a vanishing crossing, was thought to attract attention. The kind of attention no traveler wanted while sleeping on the road. This fear wasn't limited to small, fragile crossings either. Even great bridges, stone-built, city-bound, walked by thousands, carried the same quiet anxiety. What if this was the last time it would hold? What if, for you and you alone, it decided to let go? And that led to a strange ritual observed in parts of medieval Wales and Burgundy. Touching the rail or edge of the bridge before crossing. A tap with the hand, a knock with a staff, a whispered greeting, as if to say, I mean no harm. Let me pass. Not a superstition, just a courtesy, like greeting a guard at the gate. Some took it further. In the merchant cities of the Adriatic, there are mentions of travelers who would toss a small coin into the water below before crossing, not as a toll, but as a tribute. Something for the depths. A tiny exchange, safe crossing for a token of value. That idea, that the bridge itself required acknowledgement, persisted quietly for centuries, because whether it was built of oak, stone, or rope, a bridge in the Middle Ages was never just a structure. It was a moment in the landscape, a chance, a gamble, a place where, just for a few minutes, you walked not on land, but between 2 worlds. And if something changed while you were in the middle, if the bridge twisted, shifted, or vanished, then so did you. In every village, every town, and every winding medieval road that led to a river or gorge, there was an unspoken hierarchy among travelers. It wasn't about class or money. It wasn't about how fast your horse was or how much your cart carried. It was about one thing. Who would cross the bridge first? The modern mind. This might seem almost superstitious, just one more old-world anxiety. But in the medieval world, where safety was often based on shared beliefs, the first step onto a bridge mattered more than most would dare to admit. Why? Because bridges were often thought to remember, not consciously, not like a person, but as something shaped by many footsteps, many wheels, many hooves. Over time, a bridge became something more than a crossing. It became a path of intention and To be the first to step onto it each morning, or after a storm, or after someone had fallen, was to risk being the next story told about that place. And so, travelers hesitated. They would gather at the edge of a crossing, sometimes in silence, sometimes with murmured conversation, waiting to see who would go first. If there was a child among them, the tension would rise. If there was an outsider, all eyes would quietly drift toward them. And if there was someone known for taking risks, someone brave or foolish, or both, they might be encouraged with a quiet nod or the offer of shared bread. But often, no one moved. This stillness could last minutes. In rare cases, even longer. One account from a merchant's diary in 1372 describes waiting nearly half an hour at a bridge near Poitiers. Small group of traders silently debated, without a word, who should take the lead. Eventually, an old woman carrying herbs stepped forward without hesitation. Everyone watched her cross safely. Only then did the others follow. Why the fear? Because bridges had reputations. Some were known to have collapsed in the rain. Others were simply places where things happened. Strange noises, shadows under the beams, accidents no one could explain. If a horse bucked near the midpoint, or if a dog refused to step on the wood, people took notice. These events didn't need to be documented in books or town records. They were kept in memory, passed between generations in the form of subtle warnings. Don't cross that bridge at dusk. Don't ride over that one too fast. Wait if the wind's up. And most ominously, let someone else go first. This practice wasn't about cowardice. It was caution woven into culture. In a world without engineering certifications, inspections, or safety rails, bridges were judged not just by structure, but by story. Some bridges even became known for demanding a price. Not money, but a consequence. A twisted ankle, a dropped bundle, a broken wheel. These weren't considered mere accidents. They were the bridge's way of balancing itself. A reminder that every crossing had a cost, and it was better to pay in something small. The in regions with more precarious terrain, Scotland's highlands, the mountain passes of northern Italy, the cliff roads of the Pyrenees, this anxiety only intensified. A bridge in these places wasn't just a plank over a river. It was often a narrow beam over a chasm, a stretch of rope with uneven slats, or a slippery stone path suspended above mist. And yet people crossed them, because they had to. That blend of necessity and dread defined much of medieval life. You feared the crossing, but you needed what lay on the other side. There were rare individuals who relished the role of first crosser. These people, usually couriers, scouts, or those with nothing left to lose, would walk boldly onto the bridge, whistling or singing or tapping their walking stick as they went. Some communities paid them in bread, beer, or coin, but even then, few envied them, because taking the first step meant absorbing all the tension others refused to carry. And if something did go wrong, the others would say nothing. They'd wait, perhaps pray silently. Then, eventually, they would turn away, find another path, or wait for the next traveler to come along. When you picture a medieval bridge, don't just see the stone or wood. Picture the people gathered at its edge, eyes low, hearts uncertain, waiting to see if the bridge would allow them to pass, waiting to see who would dare touch the future first. By the late Middle Ages, bridges had become more than physical crossings. They were boundaries, psychological, social, and at times, political, not just from one riverbank to another, but between people, between territories, and between states. In many cases, a bridge marked a change in control. You'd leave one lord's domain and enter another. You'd exit a bishopric and enter a duchy. Sometimes, the very act of crossing meant entering a place where different laws applied, where customs shifted, where currency changed. And this alone made people uneasy. For the average traveler, a bridge wasn't a promise of continuity. It was a sign that what lay ahead might be less familiar, less forgiving. Even language could change from one side of the bridge to the other. In certain parts of Europe, particularly the borderlands of France and the Holy Roman Empire, dialects shifted from village to village. A bridge might bring you into a town where your words no longer held the same meaning, or where your name was suddenly pronounced differently. This sense of dislocation contributed to the fear. There are recorded instances of medieval villagers refusing to cross certain bridges not because of structural risk or superstition, but because they didn't trust what lay on the other side. It's easy to forget that most people in the Middle Ages lived their entire lives within just a few miles of where they were born. The bridge, then, was a threshold into the unknown, a place where your reputation didn't follow, where your neighbors weren't there to speak on your behalf. Trade caravans and messengers had to cross anyway. But for ordinary people, a bridge sometimes represented a kind of social exposure. On one side, you were part of something. On the other, you were alone. And bridges could also be places of tension. Bandits sometimes waited near them. Tax collectors set up stations at either end. Local lords imposed crossing tolls that varied wildly depending on your cargo, your face, or the mood of the guards. There's a 15th century report of a group of pilgrims who were held at a wooden bridge for over 3 hours because the gatekeeper could not read the seal on their travel writ. No harm came to them, but the delay cost them shelter in the next town, and they were forced to sleep in the open. This unpredictability only deepened the sense that bridges were not neutral. They were points of friction, places where the control of one area gave way to the control of another, and the rules, even if unwritten, shifted with them. Then there were the functioning hazards, the more mundane, yet still very real dangers today. Bridge might be too narrow for wagons to pass each other, forcing one driver to reverse their cart the entire length while others watched and waited. In cold weather, wooden planks became slick with frost. In heavy rains, muddy boots made footing treacherous. And in spring thaw, riverbanks sometimes swelled just enough to lap at the supports, undermining the stability of the crossing by degrees that a few accidents were enough to taint a bridge's name for a generation. But it's no wonder, then, that some communities built detours around bridges, even if it meant adding hours to a journey. A detour was safer, more predictable, and didn't involve negotiating who went first or what tribute was required. In some cases, footpaths over shallow fords or even makeshift rafts were preferred to the looming silhouette of a bridge. And still, despite all this fear, bridges were vital. They enabled markets to function, letters to reach faraway cities, messengers to bring news of distant wars. Without them, medieval life would have been even more fragmented than it already was. But the very importance of bridges only made them more charged. Their role as both connection and division gave them a kind of psychic weight. Even today, many of the oldest surviving bridges in Europe carry remnants of that perception: low arches, tight walkways, uneven stones. You can feel, in their construction, that they were never designed for comfort. They were designed for necessity, for control, for limit. In short, they were designed to be respected, even feared, because in the Middle Ages, a bridge wasn't just something you crossed. It was something you confronted. Bridges in the Middle Ages weren't just practical structures. They were loaded with meaning, risk, and consequence. To modern eyes, they may seem quaint. Arched stone crossings over quiet rivers, picturesque in their ruin. But to those who lived in their shadow, bridges were never just about getting from one place to another. They were moments of decision. To cross a bridge meant to leave the familiar, even briefly. It meant vulnerability, exposure, and surrendering a bit of control. Every step across the creaking planks or worn stones was a reminder that something might go wrong. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but just wrong enough to change the course of your day, your trade, your life, and that lingering fear of the unseen, the unspoken, the possibility, was enough to make bridges more than just architecture. They became thresholds, not only between lands, but between certainty and uncertainty, between what I know and what I hope will still be true on the other side. So yes, people feared bridges in the Middle Ages, not always for supernatural reasons, not always because of old tales whispered by firelight, but because bridges were honest. They made you feel the weight beneath your feet, literally and metaphorically. And they reminded you, with every step, that safety was never guaranteed. Not then, and maybe not even now.